I'm Rachel Donnelly, and I'm 34 years old. 3 years ago, my mother looked me straight in the eye and said, "You're dead to us now. Don't ever contact this family again." Those words came not because I had committed some heinous crime or betrayed anyone, but because I had made the decision to divorce my husband of 8 years. What my mother didn't know was that her cruel rejection would eventually lead to the most empowering moment of my life, when she would come crawling back, desperately needing something only I could give her. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. To understand how devastating those words were, you need to know about my upbringing in the small town of Millfield, Ohio. Population 4,000, where everyone knows everyone else's business and reputation is everything. My parents, Margaret and Robert Donnelly, were pillars of the community. Dad owned the most successful construction company in 3 counties, and Mom was president of the Ladies' Auxiliary at our Methodist church for 12 consecutive years. They had built their entire identity around being the perfect Christian family, and I was expected to be the perfect daughter who would continue that legacy. Growing up, I was the poster child for good behavior. I sang in the church choir from age 7, maintained a 4.0 GPA throughout high school, and never gave my parents a moment's worry. While my classmates were sneaking out to parties or experimenting with rebellion, I was home helping Mom prepare Sunday dinner for the extended family or accompanying Dad to community fundraisers. I genuinely enjoyed being the dutiful daughter, but looking back, I realize I never learned to think for myself or question whether the path laid out for me was actually what I wanted. When I graduated valedictorian of my high school class, there was never any question about what came next. I would attend the local community college for 2 years to save money, then transfer to Ohio State to study elementary education, because teaching was considered an appropriate career for a woman who would eventually prioritize family over profession. The plan was so ingrained that I never considered alternatives. I followed it exactly, even choosing my major based on my parents' suggestion rather than any genuine passion for education. It was during my junior year at Ohio State that I met Derek Chen, a business major whose family had moved to Columbus from California when he was in high school. Derek was everything my parents thought they wanted in a future son-in-law: ambitious, polite, and from a family that owned a successful chain of restaurants. He was also Asian American, which initially concerned my parents, though they never stated this directly. Instead, they made subtle comments about cultural differences and how important it was to marry someone who shared our values. Despite their reservations, Derek won them over with his charm and his clear financial prospects. He treated me well, opening doors and paying for dates, and he seemed to genuinely care about my opinions on things that mattered to him. When he proposed during my senior year with a beautiful diamond ring and a carefully planned evening at the fanciest restaurant in Columbus, I said yes without hesitation. It felt like the natural progression of our relationship, and my parents were thrilled that I was marrying someone who could provide for me financially. Our wedding was exactly what my mother had always envisioned for me. 200 guests at the Millfield Country Club, a dress that cost more than most people's cars, and a reception that people still talked about years later. I felt like a princess that day, surrounded by family and friends who kept telling me how perfect Derek and I looked together. The local newspaper even featured our wedding on the front page of the lifestyle section, with a headline that read, "Local Girl Marries Columbus Businessman in Fairy Tale Wedding." For the first few years of marriage, everything seemed fine on the surface. Derek got a job with a marketing firm in Columbus, and I found a position teaching 2nd grade at a suburban elementary school. We bought a beautiful house in an upscale neighborhood, drove nice cars, and took vacations to places like Cancun and the Bahamas. To everyone looking from the outside, including my parents, we had achieved the American dream. But privately, cracks were beginning to show almost immediately. Derek had very specific ideas about how our life should look, and those ideas didn't always align with mine. He wanted me to quit teaching as soon as we had children, despite the fact that I had discovered I genuinely loved working with kids and had found something I was actually passionate about for the first time in my life. He made decisions about our finances, our social calendar, and even our home decor without consulting me, assuming that as the primary breadwinner, he had the right to determine how we lived. The issues became more pronounced when we started trying to have children during our 3rd year of marriage. Month after month of negative pregnancy tests, created a tension between us that we had never experienced before. Derek became obsessed with fertility treatments and schedules, turning what should have been an intimate part of our relationship into a clinical process focused solely on results. When I suggested we take a break from trying and consider other options like adoption, he dismissed my feelings entirely, insisting that having biological children was non-negotiable. Around the same time, I began to notice how differently Derek treated me when we were alone versus when we were with other people. In public, he was the attentive husband, but at home, he increasingly spoke to me like I was an employee rather than a partner. He would criticize the way I managed household tasks, despite the fact that I was working full-time and handling most of the domestic responsibilities myself. When I tried to discuss these concerns with him, he would deflect by pointing out all the ways he provided for me financially, as if that somehow negated my feelings. The breaking point came during our 7th year of marriage, when I discovered that Derek had been making major financial decisions without telling me. He had invested a significant portion of our savings in a business venture with his brother, without discussing it with me first. When I confronted him about it, he actually seemed surprised that I was upset, explaining that since he earned most of our income, he had assumed he had the right to decide how it was used. That conversation revealed how fundamentally different our views of marriage were. I saw us as partners who should make important decisions together, while he saw himself as the head of the household who kept me informed when convenient. I started individual therapy around this time, initially hoping to work on communication skills that might help our marriage. But week after week of sessions with Dr. Linda Hoffman helped me realize that the problems in my relationship weren't about communication at all. They were about respect, equality, and the fact that I had never learned to advocate for my own needs and desires. Dr. Hoffman helped me understand that I had spent my entire life trying to be the person other people wanted me to be, first my parents and then Derek, without ever figuring out who I actually was or what I wanted. The therapy sessions were eye-opening in ways I hadn't expected. I began to recognize patterns that had been present throughout my life, ways I had been conditioned to prioritize other people's comfort over my own well-being. I realized that I had never made a major decision based purely on my own desires and instincts. Every choice, from my college major to my career to my marriage, had been filtered through other people's expectations and approval. As I became more aware of these dynamics, I started setting small boundaries at home. I insisted on being included in financial decisions. I spoke up when Derek made social commitments without consulting me.
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time. So if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now, back to the story.
I expressed my own preferences about how we spent our weekends instead of automatically deferring to his choices. Derek's reaction to these changes was immediate and hostile. He accused me of becoming selfish and difficult, suggesting that therapy was putting unrealistic ideas in my head about marriage. The situation deteriorated rapidly over several months. Derek became increasingly controlling, monitoring my phone calls and questioning my whereabouts when I wasn't at work. He started making disparaging comments about my therapy, calling it a waste of money, and suggesting that I was being manipulated by someone who didn't understand our relationship. When I continued to assert myself and refused to return to our old dynamic, he began threatening divorce, clearly expecting that the fear of losing our lifestyle would make me comply. Instead, his threats made me realize something crucial. The idea of divorce didn't scare me anymore. In fact, it felt like relief. The thought of being alone, of making my own decisions and living according to my own values, seemed infinitely preferable to continuing in a marriage where I felt like a supporting character in someone else's story. When Derek issued his ultimatum during a particularly heated argument, demanding that I choose between therapy and our marriage, I surprised both of us by choosing therapy. I filed for divorce on a Tuesday in March, exactly 8 years and 3 months after our wedding day. Derek was shocked, having apparently believed that I would never actually go through with it. He alternated between rage and attempts at manipulation, promising to change and then threatening to destroy me financially. My lawyer, Sarah Martinez, was a fierce advocate who helped me understand my rights and navigate the complex emotions of dissolving a marriage. The divorce proceedings were contentious, primarily because Derek couldn't accept that I was serious about ending our marriage. He contested every detail, from the division of assets to the sale of our house, seemingly more interested in punishing me than in reaching a fair resolution. What should have been a 6-month process stretched to over a year, during which I lived in a small apartment and drove a 10-year-old Honda Civic that Derek liked to point out, was a significant step down from the luxury SUV I had driven during our marriage. Throughout this entire process, I assumed my parents would be supportive, or at least understanding. Divorce wasn't ideal in their worldview, but surely they would recognize that I was unhappy and deserved better. I had been careful about how much I shared with them during the worst months of my marriage, not wanting to worry them or create family drama, but I had dropped enough hints about our struggles that I thought they understood things weren't perfect. I was completely unprepared for their reaction when I called to tell them about the divorce filing. I had rehearsed the conversation in my head, planning to explain that Derek and I had grown apart and wanted different things from life. I expected some disappointment, maybe some questions about whether we had tried counseling, but ultimately I thought they would support my decision to leave an unhappy marriage. Instead, my mother's first words were, "What did you do wrong?" Not concern for my well-being or curiosity about what had led to this decision, but an immediate assumption that I was somehow at fault. When I tried to explain that we simply weren't compatible and that Derek didn't treat me as an equal partner, she cut me off with a lecture about the sanctity of marriage and the importance of working through difficulties rather than giving up at the first sign of trouble. My father was even worse. He immediately launched into a speech about how divorce would reflect poorly on our family's reputation in the community. He was particularly concerned about how it would look at church, since Derek and I had been married there and were considered one of the success stories among the younger couples. The idea that his business relationships might be affected seemed to weigh heavily on his mind, as many of his clients were people who had attended our wedding and viewed us as the ideal young couple. Over the following weeks, as the reality of my decision sank in, my parents' disappointment morphed into something much more hostile. They began pressuring me to reconsider, offering to pay for marriage counseling and suggesting that I was throwing away a good life because of unrealistic expectations influenced by modern feminism and therapy. When I stood firm in my decision, their disappointment turned to anger, and their anger eventually turned to something I had never experienced from them before: complete rejection. The final confrontation happened on a Sunday afternoon in late April. I had driven to Millfield for what I thought would be a family dinner, hoping that some face-to-face time might help repair our strained relationship. Instead, I walked into an intervention of sorts. My parents had invited Derek, along with Pastor Williams from our church and my Aunt Susan, who had always been my mother's closest confidant. They had planned an elaborate attempt to convince me to withdraw the divorce papers and return to my marriage. The conversation was humiliating and infuriating in equal measure. Derek played the part of the remorseful husband perfectly, apologizing for his mistakes and promising to do better. Pastor Williams spoke about the sacred nature of marriage vows and the importance of forgiveness. My Aunt Susan shared stories of couples who had worked through difficult periods and emerged stronger. My parents presented this as an opportunity to save my marriage and restore harmony to our family. When I calmly but firmly explained that my decision was final and that I wasn't interested in reconciling with Derek, the mood in the room shifted dramatically. My mother's face went through a series of expressions, from disappointment to anger, to something I had never seen before: disgust. She looked at me like I was a stranger who had invaded her home and destroyed everything she held dear. That's when she spoke the words that changed everything between us. "If you go through with this divorce, you're dead to us. Dead to this family. We raised you better than this. And if you choose to throw away everything we taught you about commitment and values, then you're not our daughter anymore. Don't ever contact this family again." The silence that followed was deafening. I looked around the room at people who had been part of my life for decades, waiting for someone to object to my mother's harsh ultimatum. Instead, I saw nods of agreement and expressions that ranged from disappointed to disgusted. Even my father, who I had always believed loved me unconditionally, remained silent in a way that felt like agreement with my mother's declaration. I left their house that day knowing that my relationship with my family was over, at least for the foreseeable future. The drive back to Columbus was a blur of tears and disbelief. I couldn't comprehend how the people who had raised me could cut me out of their lives so completely over a decision that was ultimately about my own happiness and well-being. The rejection felt more devastating than the end of my marriage, because it came from people whose love I had never questioned. The months that followed were the loneliest of my life, but also the most liberating. Without the pressure of maintaining relationships with people who disapproved of my choices, I was free to explore who I actually was and what I wanted from life. I threw myself into my teaching with renewed passion, volunteering for extra committees, and taking on leadership roles that I had previously avoided because Derek had preferred me to minimize my work commitments. I also began to build new friendships and reconnect with old ones that had fallen by the wayside during my marriage. My colleague Jenny Martinez became a close friend, introducing me to a circle of single women who were living fulfilling lives on their own terms. I started taking art classes, something I had always wanted to try but had never made time for. I traveled to places Derek had never been interested in visiting, including a solo trip to Ireland that turned out to be one of the most meaningful experiences of my life. The divorce was finalized 14 months after I filed the papers. Derek had finally accepted that I wasn't coming back and agreed to a settlement that left us both financially stable. I bought a small house in a neighborhood I loved, adopted a rescue dog named Charlie, and settled into a life that felt authentically mine for the first time ever. During those months of rebuilding, I occasionally heard updates about my family through mutual friends and acquaintances from Millfield. My parents had apparently told people that the divorce was Derek's idea, and that I was having some kind of breakdown that prevented me from thinking clearly. They had maintained their relationship with Derek, who continued to attend church events and family gatherings as though he were still part of the family. The narrative they had constructed painted me as the unstable party who had destroyed a good marriage. While Derek was the victim of my irrational behavior, I tried not to let these stories bother me, but they stung nonetheless. The knowledge that my parents were actively working to protect their reputation at my expense confirmed what I had begun to suspect during therapy, that their love had always been conditional on my ability to make them look good to other people. This realization was painful but also clarifying. It helped me understand that their rejection, while devastating, was ultimately about their own issues rather than any real failing on my part. As my second year of post-divorce life began, I felt stronger and more confident than I ever had before. I had successfully rebuilt my life according to my own values and priorities. I had developed genuine friendships based on mutual respect and shared interests. I had discovered talents and passions that had been dormant during my years of trying to be the perfect daughter and wife. Most importantly, I had learned to trust my own judgment and advocate for my own needs, skills that served me well in every aspect of my life. The turning point came on a Thursday morning in October, exactly 2 years and 6 months after my mother had declared me dead to the family. I was in my classroom preparing for the day when my phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. The message was brief and jarring. "Rachel, this is your mother. We need to talk. It's urgent. Call me as soon as you get this." I stared at the message for several minutes, my hands shaking slightly as I processed the fact that my mother was reaching out after years of complete silence. My first instinct was to ignore it, to maintain the boundary that she had established with her cruel ultimatum. But curiosity got the better of me, and I found myself wondering what could possibly be urgent enough to prompt her to break her own rule about having no contact with me. I waited until my lunch break to call her back, wanting to have privacy for what I knew would be a difficult conversation. She answered on the first ring, as though she had been waiting by the phone. Her voice sounded smaller than I remembered, less authoritative and more uncertain. "Rachel, thank you for calling me back," she began, and I was struck by the fact that she actually thanked me, something I couldn't remember her doing often during my childhood. I know this must be surprising, hearing from me after all this time. I didn't respond immediately, waiting to see where she was going with this unexpected contact. When the silence stretched uncomfortably long, she continued with obvious difficulty. "Your father and I need your help with something. It's a legal matter, and our attorney says we need your signature on some documents. It's about your grandfather's estate. My grandfather had died 6 months earlier, though I had only learned about it through the obituary section of the Millfield newspaper online. My parents hadn't contacted me about his death, his funeral, or anything related to his passing. I had mourned him privately, remembering the man who had taught me to fish and had always slipped me extra cookies when my mother wasn't looking. The fact that they were now contacting me about his estate felt both ironic and infuriating. What kind of documents? I asked, keeping my voice neutral, despite the emotions churning inside me. My mother's explanation was halting and clearly uncomfortable. It turned out that my grandfather had included me in his will, leaving me a significant portion of his property and assets. However, there were certain legal requirements that needed my signature before the estate could be settled. My parents had been trying to handle the probate process without involving me, hoping to find a way around the legal requirements, but their attorney had finally told them it was impossible to proceed without my direct participation. The irony of the situation was not lost on me. The woman who had disowned me, who had told me I was dead to the family, now needed something from me that she couldn't get any other way. She had to humble herself and reach out to the daughter she had rejected, because legal requirements didn't care about family drama or conditional love. As she explained the situation, I could hear the strain in her voice. This was clearly difficult for her, having to admit that she needed me after cutting me out so completely. But there was something else in her tone, too. Something that sounded almost like hope. I got the sense that she was hoping this legal necessity might provide an opportunity to rebuild our relationship, though she was too proud to say so directly. I told her I would need time to think about it and would call her back with my decision. After hanging up, I sat in my empty classroom for a long time, processing this unexpected development. Part of me wanted to refuse out of spite, to let her experience the consequences of her cruel rejection. But another part of me recognized this as an opportunity for something more meaningful than mere revenge. That evening, I called Dr. Hoffman, who I still saw monthly for maintenance therapy sessions. We talked through the situation and my options, exploring both the practical and emotional implications of whatever decision I made. She helped me see that this was a chance to engage with my family from a position of strength rather than the weakness and desperation I had felt during our last encounter. Over the weekend, I made my decision. I would meet with my parents to discuss the estate matters, but it would be on my terms, in a location of my choosing, with clear boundaries about what I was and wasn't willing to discuss. I wasn't interested in a tearful reconciliation or in pretending that the past 2.5 years hadn't happened. But I was curious to see how they would handle needing something from the daughter they had rejected. I called my mother back on Monday morning and told her I would be willing to meet with them and their attorney to discuss the estate requirements. However, I insisted that the meeting take place at my attorney's office in Columbus, with Sarah Martinez present to represent my interests. I also made it clear that this meeting was strictly about legal matters, and that I wasn't interested in discussing our personal relationship or the circumstances that had led to our estrangement. My mother agreed to these terms with obvious reluctance, clearly having hoped for a more informal arrangement that might lead to personal reconciliation. But she was in no position to negotiate, and she knew it. We scheduled the meeting for the following Thursday, giving me time to brief Sarah on the situation and prepare for what I knew would be an emotionally charged encounter. The days leading up to the meeting were filled with a mixture of anxiety and anticipation. I hadn't seen my parents in over 2 years, and I wasn't sure how I would react to being in the same room with them again. I found myself alternating between anger at their hypocrisy and a strange sense of excitement at the prospect of finally having some power in our relationship dynamic. I spent considerable time choosing what to wear for the meeting, ultimately settling on a professional dress that made me feel confident and authoritative. I wanted to look successful and self-possessed, to show them that I had thrived despite their rejection. I also wanted to present myself as someone who was no longer the compliant daughter they had once known, but rather a woman who had learned to advocate for herself and wouldn't be easily manipulated. The morning of the meeting, I woke up early and spent extra time on my appearance, knowing that first impressions would be important in setting the tone for our interaction. I arrived at Sarah's office 15 minutes early, wanting to be settled and composed before my parents arrived. Sarah and I reviewed the estate documents one more time and discussed strategy for handling whatever emotional manipulation my parents might attempt. When my parents walked into the conference room, I was struck by how much older they looked. My father's hair had gone completely gray, and my mother seemed smaller somehow, less imposing than the woman who had dominated my childhood. They both appeared nervous and uncertain, clearly uncomfortable with the formal setting and the presence of attorneys. The initial greetings were stilted and awkward. My mother attempted a hug, but I stepped back and offered a handshake instead, establishing an immediate boundary about the level of intimacy I was comfortable with. My father looked around the conference room as though he couldn't quite believe he was meeting his daughter in such a formal setting. Their attorney, a middle-aged man named Thompson who had been handling their legal affairs for years, took charge of the meeting initially, explaining the estate requirements and the specific documents that needed my signature. The process was straightforward from a legal standpoint, but it quickly became clear that my parents had hoped for much more than a simple business transaction. As Mr. Thompson outlined the details of my grandfather's will and the assets I stood to inherit, my mother kept trying to inject personal comments and observations into the conversation. She mentioned how proud my grandfather had been of me, how he had always talked about my accomplishments, and how he had wanted to make sure I was taken care of. These comments felt like attempts to emotionally manipulate me into softening toward my parents, but they had the opposite effect, reminding me of how much I had lost when they cut me out of the family. The most revealing moment came when my father tried to suggest that we handle the estate matters informally, without involving attorneys or formal documentation. He proposed that I simply trust them to manage my inheritance appropriately, claiming that family should be able to work things out without legal interference. Sarah immediately objected to this suggestion, and I backed her up, making it clear that everything would be handled through proper legal channels. My parents' reaction to this insistence on formal procedures was telling. They seemed genuinely surprised that I didn't trust them to handle my financial interests appropriately, apparently having forgotten that they had disowned me and cut off all contact. The idea that their treatment of me might have consequences for their ability to conduct business with me seemed not to have occurred to them. As the meeting progressed, it became increasingly clear that my parents had assumed this legal necessity would provide an opportunity for family reconciliation. They kept making references to future holidays and family gatherings, speaking as though my participation in the estate process automatically meant I would be resuming my place in the family. When I didn't respond to these overtures, my mother became more direct. "Rachel, we've missed you," she said during a break in the legal proceedings. "The family hasn't been the same without you. We hope this can be a fresh start for all of us." I looked at her for a long moment before responding. "You told me I was dead to you. You cut me out of your lives completely because I made a decision about my own marriage that you didn't approve of. Now you need something from me, and suddenly I'm family again. Do you see how that might feel manipulative to me?" The silence that followed was uncomfortable for everyone in the room. My parents exchanged glances, clearly not having expected me to be so direct about the circumstances of our estrangement. Mr. Thompson busied himself with paperwork, obviously wishing he wasn't witnessing this family drama. My mother's response was defensive, rather than apologetic. "We were disappointed and hurt by your choices. We said things in the heat of the moment that maybe we didn't mean exactly as they sounded. But you're still our daughter, and we love you." "You have a strange way of showing love," I replied calmly. "Cutting someone out of your life completely isn't typically how love is expressed. And calling me only when you need my signature suggests that your current interest in reconciliation is more about convenience than genuine care." The legal portion of the meeting concluded with me signing the necessary documents under terms that protected my interests and ensured I would have direct control over my inheritance. I made it clear that any future contact between us would need to acknowledge the harm they had caused and demonstrate genuine change in their attitudes and behavior. As we prepared to leave, my father made one final attempt at reconciliation. "Rachel, I know we made mistakes. Your mother and I would like a chance to make things right. Could we take you to dinner sometime soon to talk things through?" I considered his request carefully before responding. "I appreciate that you acknowledge making mistakes. But saying you made mistakes and actually understanding what you did wrong are two different things. If you want to have a relationship with me going forward, you need to take responsibility for the specific ways you hurt me, not just offer vague apologies." I left the meeting feeling a complex mixture of emotions. There was satisfaction in having handled the situation from a position of strength, in showing my parents that I was no longer the compliant daughter who could be manipulated or controlled. But there was also sadness at the realization that they still didn't seem to understand the depth of the harm they had caused, or the work that would be required to rebuild trust between us. In the weeks that followed, my mother made several attempts to reach out, sending text messages that ranged from casual small talk to more serious attempts at discussion about our relationship. I responded selectively, engaging when she seemed genuinely interested in understanding my perspective but ignoring messages that felt like attempts to sweep our history under the rug. The process of potentially rebuilding a relationship with my parents was slow and often frustrating. They seemed to want to return to our old dynamic without acknowledging how that dynamic had been harmful to me. They had difficulty understanding that their conditional love and rigid expectations had contributed to years of anxiety and self-doubt that I was still working to overcome. But there were also moments of genuine progress. During one phone conversation, my mother admitted that she had been more concerned about appearances and community opinion than about my actual happiness during my marriage. She acknowledged that their treatment of me after the divorce had been cruel, and that she regretted the harsh words she had spoken during our final confrontation. My father's growth was more gradual, but he eventually came to understand that his silence during my mother's ultimatum had been as hurtful as her actual words. He began making efforts to communicate with me directly, rather than always deferring to my mother's lead in family matters. The estate situation ultimately provided a catalyst for necessary conversations that might never have happened otherwise. The legal requirement that brought us back into contact forced them to confront the consequences of their rejection and gave me the opportunity to engage with them from a position of strength rather than desperation. 6 months after that initial meeting, we had progressed to occasional dinners and phone calls, though our relationship remained tentative and required constant navigation of old wounds and new boundaries. I made it clear that any future relationship would need to be based on mutual respect and acceptance of my autonomy as an adult, not on their approval of my life choices. The experience taught me valuable lessons about the difference between reconciliation and restoration. While we were able to rebuild some form of relationship, it would never be the same as it had been before their rejection. Trust, once broken so completely, takes time to rebuild, and some damage is permanent. But perhaps most importantly, I learned that their approval was no longer necessary for my happiness or sense of self-worth. The woman who had once desperately sought their validation had grown into someone who could engage with them as an equal, offering relationship on her own terms rather than accepting whatever scraps of affection they were willing to provide. The inheritance from my grandfather ultimately allowed me to pay off my house and start a small college fund for my future, but the real value of that estate situation was the opportunity it provided to reclaim my power in family relationships that had always been defined by their control and my compliance. Sometimes the very people who reject us end up providing the greatest opportunities for growth and self-discovery, though rarely in the ways they intended. Looking back now, I can see that my mother's cruel words about me being dead to the family were actually a gift, though I couldn't recognize it at the time. They forced me to learn to live without their approval, and to build a life based on my own values and desires. When they eventually came back into my life needing something from me, I was strong enough to engage on my own terms rather than simply grateful for any attention they were willing to give. The journey from rejection to empowerment wasn't easy, but it was necessary. It taught me that family relationships, like all relationships, must be based on mutual respect and genuine care, not on obligation or appearances. And sometimes the people who hurt us the most end up providing the greatest opportunities for growth, especially when we learn to transform their rejection into our own liberation. The morning after that first phone call with my mother, I woke up feeling something I hadn't experienced in years when it came to my family: control. For the first time in my entire relationship with my parents, they needed something from me that they couldn't get anywhere else. The irony wasn't lost on me that the grandfather, who had always been the gentlest member of our family, would be the one to give me this unexpected leverage from beyond the grave. I spent the drive to work thinking about my grandfather, Rachel Donnelly, and how different he had been from his son. Where my father was rigid and concerned with appearances, Grandpa Ed had been warm and accepting. He never questioned my choices or made me feel like I had to earn his love through perfect behavior. During family gatherings, he was the one who would slip away from the formal dining room to help me with puzzles in the den, or teach me card games that my mother considered inappropriate for children. When I was 12, I had confided in him that I wanted to be an artist when I grew up, not a teacher like everyone expected. Instead of explaining why that wasn't practical, He had taken me to his workshop in the garage and shown me his own watercolor paintings that he had been working on in secret for decades. They were beautiful landscapes of places he had visited during his time in the military, painted with a skill that surprised me. He made me promise never to tell my father about his hobby, explaining that some people wouldn't understand the importance of creating something beautiful just for the joy of it. That memory made his decision to include me significantly in his will even more meaningful. He had seen something in me that deserved nurturing, even when my own parents couldn't recognize it. The fact that his final act would force my parents to acknowledge my worth and seek me out felt like his last gift to the granddaughter who had always understood him. I decided to take my time responding to my mother's request. She had waited 2.5 years to contact me, so she could wait a few days to hear back. I wanted to approach this situation strategically, not emotionally. That evening, I called Sarah Martinez, the attorney who had handled my divorce, to discuss the legal implications of whatever my parents were asking me to sign. Sarah listened carefully as I explained the situation, occasionally asking clarifying questions about the timeline and the nature of my estrangement from my family. When I finished, she was quiet for a moment before speaking. "Rachel, this sounds like an opportunity for you to set some terms. If they need your signature, you have negotiating power. The question is, what you want to accomplish with this interaction. Are you interested in rebuilding a relationship with them, or are you more focused on handling the legal matter and moving on?" It was a good question, one I hadn't fully considered. Part of me was curious about whether my parents had changed at all during our years of separation. Another part of me wanted them to experience the consequences of their rejection firsthand. But there was also a small voice wondering if this might be a chance for genuine reconciliation, though I was hesitant to hope for something that might leave me disappointed again. "I think I want to see how they handle needing something from me," I told Sarah. "For my entire life, our relationship has been about me meeting their expectations and seeking their approval. This is the first time the dynamic is reversed, and I'm curious to see if they're capable of treating me with the respect they never showed before." Sarah helped me think through different scenarios and strategies for managing whatever meeting might result from this situation. She offered to be present for any legal discussions, which felt like a smart precaution given my family's history of manipulation and control. We scheduled a follow-up call for later in the week after I had spoken with my mother again. 3 days after her initial text, I finally called my mother back. She answered immediately, and I could hear relief in her voice when she realized it was me. Her eagerness was both satisfying and slightly pathetic. This was a woman who had once held all the power in our relationship, and now she was clearly anxious about whether I would even speak to her. "Rachel, thank you so much for calling me back," she said, and again I was struck by her uncharacteristic gratitude. "I was hoping we could arrange a time to meet and discuss the estate situation. Your father and I could drive up to Columbus, or if you prefer, you could come home to Millfield." The casual use of the word home irritated me immediately. Millfield hadn't been my home for years, and the assumption that I would naturally want to return there for this meeting revealed that she still didn't understand how completely she had severed our relationship with her ultimatum. "I'll need to understand exactly what documents you're referring to before I agree to any meeting," I told her. "Can you have your attorney send me copies of the relevant paperwork so I can review it with my own legal counsel?" There was a pause, and I could practically hear her processing the fact that I had my own attorney and wasn't simply going to trust her and my father to handle my interests appropriately. This was clearly not how she had envisioned this conversation going. "Of course, if that's what you prefer," she said, though her tone suggested she found my caution unnecessary and hurtful. "I just thought we could handle this as a family, without making it overly complicated with lawyers and formalities." "We're not handling anything as a family," I said calmly. "You made it very clear that I'm not part of this family anymore. This is a legal matter between individuals who happen to be related. If you want my cooperation, it needs to be handled through proper channels with appropriate documentation." Another pause, longer this time. When she spoke again, her voice was smaller, less certain. "Rachel, I know things ended badly between us, but surely we can put that behind us for something as important as your grandfather's estate. He loved you so much, and he would want us to work together on this." The attempt to use my grandfather's memory to manipulate me into compliance was both predictable and infuriating. If Grandpa Ed wanted us to work together, maybe he should have talked to you about treating your children with basic respect while he was alive. Don't use his name to try to guilt me into ignoring the way you've treated me." The conversation ended with her promising to have their attorney send me the estate documents within a few days. I hung up feeling energized by my ability to maintain clear boundaries and refuse to be drawn into her emotional manipulation. This was not the compliant daughter she remembered, and I could tell that reality was difficult for her to accept. The documents arrived by certified mail the following week, and I immediately forwarded them to Sarah for review. The estate was more substantial than I had realized. My grandfather had been quietly accumulating property and investments over the decades, and his will divided everything between his 3 grandchildren, my brother David, my cousin Michael, and myself. However, my portion included the family farmhouse where my grandfather had lived for the last 20 years of his life, along with the surrounding 40 acres of land. The complication was that my parents had been living in that farmhouse since my grandfather's death, apparently assuming they would inherit it. According to the will, however, the property belonged to me, and they were essentially squatters. The estate couldn't be settled until I decided what to do with the property, and any decision required my signature on multiple documents. Sarah's analysis revealed several interesting details that my mother had conveniently omitted from her phone call. First, my parents owed significant back taxes on some of the property, taxes they had apparently been responsible for paying while living there. Second, there were some complications with the title that required my active participation to resolve. Third, and most importantly, I had the right to take immediate possession of the farmhouse if I chose to do so. "This is quite a position of strength," Sarah observed during our meeting. "Your parents need you to cooperate to resolve the estate, but you have the legal right to make their living situation very uncomfortable if you choose to. The question is what outcome you're hoping for." I thought about it carefully. I had no interest in moving back to Millfield or managing rural property, but I also wasn't inclined to make things easy for parents who had cut me out of their lives so cruelly. The farmhouse held many happy memories of time spent with my grandfather, and the idea of my parents living there after rejecting me felt somehow wrong. I want to meet with them and their attorney, I decided, but it needs to be on my terms, in a neutral location, with you present. I want them to understand that their behavior has consequences, and that they can't just ignore the past 2.5 years because it's convenient for them now. Sarah helped me draft a response to their attorney, outlining my conditions for any meeting. We would meet at her office in Columbus. Both attorneys would be present. Any discussion of personal family matters would be strictly off limits, and the focus would remain on the legal requirements for settling the estate. Most importantly, I would not be signing anything during the initial meeting. I wanted time to review any agreements and consider my options. My mother's response to these conditions was immediate and predictably emotional. She called me within hours of receiving Sarah's letter, her voice tight with frustration and hurt. "Rachel, why are you making this so difficult? We're family. We should be able to sit down together and work this out without all these lawyers and formal procedures. Your father is very upset about having to drive to Columbus and pay attorney fees for something that should be a simple conversation." "You disowned me," I reminded her. "You told me I was dead to you. Now you want to handle estate matters as family? You can't have it both ways. Either I'm your daughter and deserving of respect and consideration, or I'm not family and this is a business transaction. Which is it?" The question clearly flustered her, because it forced her to confront the contradiction in her approach. She wanted me to act like a loving daughter when it suited her needs, but she wasn't prepared to acknowledge the way she had failed to act like a loving mother when I needed her support. "You're being vindictive," she accused. "This isn't about punishing us. It's about honoring your grandfather's wishes and handling his estate responsibly." "Actually, it is about punishing you," I said, surprising myself with my honesty. "Not in a petty way, but in a way that has natural consequences. You taught me that love in this family is conditional, and that relationships can be severed when someone doesn't meet your expectations. Now you need something from me, and you're discovering that the relationship you destroyed isn't automatically restored just because you want it to be." The meeting was scheduled for the following Thursday, giving both sides time to prepare. In the days leading up to it, I found myself alternating between anticipation and anxiety. Part of me was excited to see my parents again, despite everything that had happened. They had been central figures in my life for 3 decades, and their absence had left a void that I had learned to live with but never fully filled. But I was also nervous about how I would react to seeing them in person. Phone conversations were one thing, but being in the same room with people who had rejected me so completely would be an emotional challenge. I spent extra time with Dr. Hoffman that week, processing my feelings and preparing for various scenarios that might unfold during the meeting. "Remember that you get to control how much emotion you bring to this interaction," she reminded me. "You can choose to engage with them as people you have a history with, or you can choose to treat this as a business transaction with strangers. Neither approach is right or wrong, but being clear about your own intentions will help you stay grounded." I decided to aim for professional courtesy. I would be polite but not warm, businesslike but not cold. I wanted to demonstrate that I had grown into a competent adult who could handle complex situations without losing emotional control. Most importantly, I wanted them to see that their approval was no longer necessary for my confidence or sense of self-worth. The morning of the meeting, I chose my outfit carefully. I wore a navy blue dress that made me feel professional and authoritative, paired with heels that brought me to my full height. I wanted to look successful and self-possessed, someone who had clearly thrived despite their rejection. I arrived at Sarah's office 15 minutes early, wanting to be settled and composed before my parents arrived. When they walked into the conference room, I was struck by how much they had aged. My father's hair had gone completely white, and my mother looked frailer than I remembered. They both seemed nervous and uncertain, clearly uncomfortable with the formal setting and the presence of attorneys. The confident, controlling parents of my childhood had been replaced by people who looked almost vulnerable. The initial greetings were awkward. My mother attempted to hug me, but I stepped back and offered a handshake instead, establishing an immediate boundary about the level of intimacy I was comfortable with. My father looked around the conference room as though he couldn't quite believe he was meeting his daughter in such a formal setting. Their attorney, James Thompson, was a man I vaguely remembered from my childhood. He had handled various legal matters for my family over the years and had attended my wedding. His presence added another layer of surreal familiarity to an already strange situation. He clearly felt uncomfortable being caught in the middle of family drama, frequently clearing his throat and shuffling papers as though hoping to redirect attention to the legal matters at hand. As Mr. Thompson outlined the estate situation, several details became clear that my mother had not shared during our phone conversations. The back taxes on the property were substantial, totaling nearly $15,000. My parents had apparently been living in the farmhouse rent-free since my grandfather's death, assuming they would inherit it and never bothering to clarify the legal situation. Now they found themselves in the awkward position of owing money on property that belonged to their estranged daughter. More importantly, I learned that the estate couldn't be settled until the property issues were resolved, which meant my parents' inheritance from other aspects of my grandfather's will was also tied up. They needed my cooperation not just to continue living in the farmhouse but to access the money my grandfather had left them. Their financial situation was apparently more precarious than they had let on. "So let me make sure I understand this correctly," I said, addressing Mr. Thompson directly. "My parents have been living in property that belongs to me, they owe back taxes on that property, and they can't access their own inheritance until I agree to resolve these issues. Is that accurate?" Mr. Thompson nodded uncomfortably. "That's essentially correct, yes. The estate is complicated by the property situation, and your signature is required on multiple documents before we can proceed with distribution." I looked across the table at my parents, who were both avoiding eye contact. The power dynamic in our relationship had shifted completely, and they clearly didn't know how to navigate this new reality. For my entire life, they had held all the cards in our relationship. They controlled the money, the property, the family connections, and most importantly, the emotional approval that I had always craved. Now I controlled something they needed, and they had no leverage to force my compliance. "What exactly are you asking me to sign?" I inquired, still directing my questions to the attorney rather than to my parents directly. Mr. Thompson shuffled through a stack of papers. "There are several documents. First, an agreement allowing your parents to remain in the farmhouse as tenants, with terms to be negotiated. Second, a payment plan for the back taxes they owe. Third, various estate distribution forms that would allow the remaining assets to be distributed according to your grandfather's will. And if I choose not to sign these documents? I asked. Another uncomfortable silence. Finally, Mr. Thompson answered. Then the estate remains in limbo. Your parents would need to vacate the property they're currently occupying, and they would be responsible for any additional taxes and fees that accumulate during the delay. I sat back in my chair, processing this information. My parents looked increasingly uncomfortable as the full implications of their situation became clear. They had gambled that I would be eager to reconcile and would therefore cooperate with whatever they needed. Instead, they were discovering that their rejection had consequences they hadn't anticipated. I need time to consider my options, I told Mr. Thompson. I'm not prepared to sign anything today. I'll need to review these documents with my attorney and decide how I want to proceed. My mother finally spoke up, her voice strained. Rachel, please. We know we made mistakes, but this is about your grandfather's wishes, not about our disagreements. He wanted you to have the farmhouse, but he also wanted the family to stay together. Surely we can find a way to work this out. Did he want the family to stay together? I asked. Because from where I'm sitting, it looks like he gave me the tools to make my own decisions about who I want in my life and on what terms. Maybe he understood something about family dynamics that you never learned. The accusation hung in the air, and I could see my parents exchanging glances. They had expected this meeting to be about logistics and paperwork, not about confronting the choices they had made during our estrangement. My father cleared his throat. Rachel, we've missed you. The family hasn't been the same without you. We were hoping this could be an opportunity for all of us to move forward. You've missed me? I repeated. That's interesting, because you haven't made any attempt to contact me in 2.5 years. You missed my birthday, missed holidays, missed every opportunity to show that you actually cared about having me in your lives. Now you need something from me, and suddenly you've missed me. Do you understand how that sounds? Another uncomfortable silence. Mr. Thompson was actively avoiding eye contact now, clearly wishing he wasn't witnessing this family confrontation. We were hurt by your choices, my mother said defensively. We didn't know how to bridge that gap. You told me I was dead to you, I reminded her. You didn't say you were hurt or disappointed. You didn't say you needed time to process. You told me I was dead to your family, and never to contact you again. Those weren't words spoken in hurt. Those were words chosen to cause maximum damage. And they succeeded. The conversation continued for another hour, with my parents alternating between defensive justifications for their behavior and increasingly desperate attempts to convince me to sign the estate documents. They seemed to believe that if they could just find the right combination of guilt, family obligation, and emotional manipulation, I would return to being the compliant daughter they remembered. Instead, I remained calm and professional, refusing to be drawn into emotional arguments or to make any commitments about my decisions regarding the estate. I asked detailed questions about the property, the taxes, and the timeline for resolving various issues. I made it clear that I would be consulting with my own advisors before making any decisions. As the meeting concluded, my mother made one final attempt at reconciliation. Rachel, I know we hurt you, but you're still our daughter, and we love you. Can't we find a way to put the past behind us and move forward as a family? I considered her question carefully before responding. Love isn't just a feeling, Mom. It's also a choice and a commitment. You chose to cut me out of your lives when I made a decision you didn't approve of. You chose to prioritize your image in the community over your relationship with your daughter. Now you're asking me to put the past behind us, but you haven't acknowledged what that past actually included or taken responsibility for the choices you made. What do you want from us? My father asked, sounding genuinely confused. I want you to understand that relationships have consequences, I told him. You taught me that love in this family is conditional, and that I could be discarded when I didn't meet your expectations. Now you want something from me, and you're discovering that the relationship you destroyed isn't automatically restored just because you need it to be. I left the meeting with copies of all the estate documents and a promise to provide my decision within 2 weeks. As I walked to my car, I felt a complex mixture of emotions. There was satisfaction in having handled the situation from a position of strength. in showing my parents that I was no longer the dependent daughter they could control and manipulate. But there was also sadness at seeing how little they seemed to understand about the damage they had caused, or the work that would be required to rebuild trust between us. Over the following days, I spent considerable time reviewing the estate documents with Sarah, and thinking about what outcome I actually wanted from this situation. I could make things very difficult for my parents by refusing to cooperate, or by demanding harsh terms for any agreement. I could also be generous and accommodating, essentially letting them off the hook for their behavior in exchange for a tentative reconciliation. But neither of those extremes felt right to me. What I really wanted was for them to understand that relationships require mutual respect, and that their treatment of me had been unacceptable. I wanted them to experience some natural consequences for their choices, while also leaving the door open for genuine reconciliation if they were willing to do the work required. After much consideration, I decided on a middle path. I would sign the estate documents, but with conditions that protected my interests and sent a clear message about the new terms of our relationship. My parents could remain in the farmhouse, but as tenants paying fair market rent. They would be responsible for all back taxes and ongoing property maintenance. Most importantly, any future contact between us would need to acknowledge the harm they had caused and demonstrate genuine change in their attitudes and behavior. Sarah helped me draft a response that outlined these terms in clear legal language. The proposal was fair but firm, offering my parents a path forward while making it clear that I would no longer accept being treated as a secondary consideration in their lives. When my mother received the proposal, her response was immediate and emotional. She called me within hours, her voice tight with frustration and disappointment. "Rachel, these terms are so formal and cold. We're talking about the family home, about honoring your grandfather's memory. Why can't we just work something out together without all these legal requirements and rental agreements?" "Because trust is earned," I told her. "You broke my trust when you disowned me, and formal agreements are necessary until that trust is rebuilt. If you want a relationship with me going forward, it needs to be based on mutual respect, not on my willingness to ignore the past." The negotiations continued for several more weeks, with my parents' attorney pushing back on various terms, while Sarah advocated for my interests. Throughout the process, I remained firm on the key points, while showing flexibility on minor details. I wanted my parents to understand that cooperation was possible, but only on terms that acknowledged the new reality of our relationship. The most difficult conversation came when my mother called to ask if I would consider moving back to Millfield and living in the farmhouse myself. The suggestion was clearly motivated by her hope that proximity might lead to renewed closeness between us, but it also revealed how little she understood about the life I had built for myself. "Mom, I have a career, a home, and a life in Columbus," I explained. "I'm not going to give up everything I've worked for to move back to a town where everyone knows the story of my divorce and your rejection of me. That's not rebuilding a relationship. That's asking me to return to being the person you wanted me to be, instead of accepting who I actually am." Eventually, we reached an agreement that satisfied both the legal requirements and my personal boundaries. My parents would remain in the farmhouse as tenants, paying market-rate rent and maintaining the property appropriately. The back taxes would be paid from my grandfather's other assets, but my parents would be responsible for all future obligations. Most importantly, the agreement included language requiring respectful communication and acknowledging my autonomy as an adult. The day we signed the final documents was emotionally charged for everyone involved. My parents seemed relieved to have the estate matters resolved, but also subdued by the formal nature of our new arrangement. I felt satisfied with the outcome, but also somewhat sad that it had taken legal necessity to force this level of respect and acknowledgement from people who should have offered it freely. As we prepared to leave Sarah's office after the final signing, my mother made one more attempt at personal connection. "Rachel, now that this is settled, maybe we could have dinner sometime soon. Just the three of us to talk about, well, about everything." I considered her request carefully. "I'm open to that possibility," I told her. "But any future relationship between us needs to start with acknowledgement of what happened and genuine accountability for the choices you made. I'm not interested in pretending the past 2.5 years didn't happen, or in going back to the way things were before." The estate settlement marked the beginning of a slow and often difficult process of potentially rebuilding our relationship. My parents struggled to understand that forgiveness didn't mean forgetting, and that trust, once broken, requires consistent action over time to rebuild. They wanted immediate restoration of closeness and warmth, while I needed evidence of genuine change in their attitudes and behavior. But for the first time in my life, I was engaging with my parents from a position of equality rather than dependence. I had something they needed, and they had learned that their approval was no longer necessary for my well-being or success. The daughter they had rejected had grown into a woman who could stand her ground and demand respect, and that fundamental shift changed everything about how we related to each other going forward. The first dinner we shared after signing the estate documents took place 6 weeks later at a neutral restaurant halfway between Columbus and Millfield. I had suggested the location specifically because I wanted to avoid the emotional weight of either my childhood home or my current space. The drive there gave me time to prepare mentally for what I knew would be an emotionally challenging conversation. My parents arrived looking nervous and overdressed, as though they were attending a job interview rather than dinner with their daughter. The awkwardness was palpable as we were seated at a corner table, each of us uncertain about how to navigate this unfamiliar dynamic. For 34 years, our interactions had followed predictable patterns of authority and compliance. Now we were attempting something entirely new, a relationship between equals. The conversation started with safe topics like the weather and local news from Millfield, but the underlying tension was impossible to ignore. Finally, my father cleared his throat and addressed what we were all thinking. "Rachel, we owe you an apology. A real one, not the half-hearted attempts we made during those legal meetings. What we said to you after your divorce was cruel and wrong, and we've regretted it every day since." His words surprised me with their directness. Throughout my childhood, my father had rarely acknowledged making mistakes, let alone apologized for them. I waited to see if he would continue, or if this would be the extent of his accountability. "We were so focused on how your divorce would reflect on our family's reputation that we completely lost sight of what you were going through," my mother added, her voice shaking slightly. "We should have been supporting you during one of the most difficult periods of your life. Instead, we made it worse by cutting you off when you needed us most." The admission felt significant, but I had learned to be cautious about accepting apologies that might be motivated more by current needs than genuine remorse. "What changed?" I asked. "Why are you able to see this differently now?" My parents exchanged glances before my mother answered. "Honestly, losing you made us realize what we had taken for granted. And watching you handle the estate situation with such strength and maturity forced us to confront the fact that we had been treating you like a child who needed our guidance rather than an adult who deserved our respect. Also," my father added reluctantly, "several people in town made it clear that they thought our treatment of you was inappropriate. Your Aunt Susan was particularly vocal about her disapproval. It became harder to maintain the narrative that you were the problem when people we respected were questioning our behavior." This revelation was both validating and disappointing. I was glad that others had recognized the unfairness of their treatment, but it stung to realize that their change in perspective had been influenced by social pressure rather than purely internal reflection. "I appreciate the apology," I told them carefully, "but I need you to understand that words alone aren't enough to rebuild the trust that was broken. You didn't just hurt my feelings or make me angry. You fundamentally changed how I see our family and what I can expect from you as parents." The conversation continued for nearly 3 hours, covering topics we had never discussed openly before. They asked about my life in Columbus, my teaching career, my friendships, and my perspective on the divorce. For the first time, they seemed genuinely interested in understanding my experience, rather than judging it or trying to change it. I shared some of what I had learned in therapy about family dynamics and conditional love, explaining how their expectations and demands for compliance had affected my self-esteem and decision-making abilities. They listened with what appeared to be genuine attention, occasionally asking questions that suggested they were trying to understand, rather than simply waiting for their turn to defend themselves. The most emotional moment came when my mother asked about my current dating life and whether I had any interest in remarrying someday. The question itself wasn't particularly difficult, but her tone suggested genuine curiosity about my happiness rather than concern about appearances or family planning. I'm open to the possibility of marriage again, I told her, but only with someone who sees me as an equal partner and respects my autonomy. I've learned that I'd rather be single than be in a relationship where I have to diminish myself to make someone else comfortable. My father nodded slowly. That sounds like wisdom learned the hard way. I'm sorry we weren't supportive when you were figuring that out in your first marriage. By the end of dinner, we had established some ground rules for moving forward. Contact would be regular but not overwhelming, perhaps a phone call every week or two and dinner once a month. They would respect my boundaries about topics I wasn't ready to discuss, and I would try to be patient as they learned new ways of relating to me. Most importantly, any backsliding into old patterns of control or manipulation would result in immediate consequences, including reduced contact. The months that followed were a gradual process of rebuilding trust and establishing new patterns of interaction. My parents made genuine efforts to treat me as an independent adult, asking about my opinions rather than offering unsolicited advice and respecting my decisions even when they disagreed with them. The progress wasn't always smooth, and there were several conversations where old habits surfaced and had to be addressed directly. One particularly challenging moment came when my mother suggested that I consider moving back to Millfield permanently, ostensibly because the cost of living was lower and I could be closer to family. The suggestion felt like a disguised attempt to return to old patterns of dependence and geographic control, and I addressed it immediately. Mom, I understand that you'd like me to live closer, but I've built a life in Columbus that makes me happy. Suggesting that I give up my career and community to move back to Millfield sounds like you still don't fully accept that I'm an adult who gets to make my own choices about where and how to live. To her credit, my mother recognized the criticism as valid and apologized for overstepping. These corrections became easier over time as we all learned to navigate our new dynamic with more awareness and sensitivity. The real test of our rebuilt relationship came 8 months after the estate settlement, when my brother David announced that he and his wife were getting divorced. The irony of the situation was not lost on any of us, and I watched carefully to see how my parents would handle this new family crisis. To my surprise and relief, they responded to David's divorce with compassion and support, offering to help with childcare and emotional support, rather than judgment or rejection. When I pointed out the contrast between their reactions to his divorce and mine, they acknowledged the difference directly. "We learned from our mistakes with you," my father explained during one of our monthly dinners. "We saw how our reaction to your divorce damaged our relationship and hurt someone we love. We weren't going to make the same error twice." David's divorce also created an opportunity for us to reconnect as siblings. He reached out to me for advice about navigating the legal and emotional challenges of ending a marriage, and I was able to share both practical guidance and emotional support. Our relationship had been strained during the years of my estrangement from our parents, partly because he had never challenged their treatment of me. Now he seemed to understand more fully what I had experienced and why their rejection had been so devastating. "I should have spoken up for you," he admitted during one of our conversations. "I knew what they were doing was wrong, but I was afraid of becoming the target of their disapproval myself. That was cowardly, and I'm sorry." His apology meant more to me than he probably realized. Growing up, David and I had been close despite the 2-year age difference, and his silence during my parents' rejection had felt like a second betrayal. Having him acknowledge his role in that dynamic helped heal a wound I hadn't even fully recognized. As my second year of renewed contact with my parents progressed, I began to see genuine changes in their attitudes and behavior. They started asking about my friends and interests with what seemed like authentic curiosity. They stopped making suggestions about my life choices unless I specifically asked for advice. Most importantly, they began sharing more about their own struggles and uncertainties, treating me as someone capable of offering support rather than someone who only needed guidance. The relationship was different from what we had shared during my childhood and young adulthood, but in many ways it was healthier. We interacted as adults with mutual respect rather than as authority figures and dependent child. The conversations were more honest, the boundaries were clearer, and the love felt less conditional. One particularly meaningful conversation occurred during a visit to the farmhouse that I now owned but where they lived as tenants. Walking through the rooms where I had spent so many happy hours with my grandfather, I felt a sense of closure about the past and hope for the future. "You know," my mother said as we sat on the porch where my grandfather used to teach me card games, He would be proud of how you handled all of this. He always said you had more strength than you realized." The comment brought tears to my eyes, partly because it felt like a genuine observation rather than an attempt at manipulation, and partly because it connected me to the grandfather who had seen my potential even when I couldn't see it myself. 2 years after our reconciliation began, my parents surprised me by attending a school event where I was receiving an award for excellence in teaching. They drove the 2 hours to Columbus without being asked, sat through a ceremony where they knew no one else, and afterward took me out for a celebration dinner. The gesture felt significant, not because of its grand nature, but because it demonstrated their willingness to enter my world and support my achievements on my terms. During that dinner, my father made an observation that showed how much his perspective had evolved. "You know, Rachel, watching you rebuild your life after the divorce and seeing how you handled the estate situation, I've realized that we raised you better than we knew. You have a strength and integrity that we should have recognized and celebrated, instead of trying to control." The acknowledgement felt like a completion of sorts, a recognition that their previous attempts to shape me into their image of the perfect daughter had actually interfered with their ability to see and appreciate who I really was. As I reflect on this journey now, 3 years after that first desperate phone call from my mother about needing my signature, I'm struck by how much we've all changed. My parents learned that love requires respect, and that relationships can't survive on obligation and appearance alone. I learned that I could demand better treatment, and that my worth wasn't dependent on their approval or anyone else's. The estate situation that brought us back together wasn't just about property or money. It was about power, respect, and the opportunity to redefine our relationships on healthier terms. My grandfather's final gift wasn't the farmhouse or the land, but the leverage that forced all of us to confront the dysfunction in our family dynamics and work towards something better. The woman who had once desperately sought her parents' approval learned to live without it, and in doing so, earned something far more valuable: a relationship based on mutual respect rather than conditional acceptance. Sometimes the people who reject us end up providing the greatest opportunities for growth, especially when we learn to transform their rejection into our own empowerment. Our relationship now isn't perfect, and probably never will be. We still have disagreements and moments of tension, but we've learned to address conflicts directly, rather than allowing resentment to fester. We treat each other as adults capable of making our own decisions and living with the consequences. Most importantly, we've all accepted that love isn't about making people conform to our expectations, but about supporting them and becoming their authentic selves. The journey from rejection to reconciliation taught me that sometimes the most painful experiences become the catalysts for the most meaningful growth. My parents' cruel words about me being dead to the family forced me to learn to live without their approval, and that independence ultimately made possible a relationship based on choice rather than obligation. When they came back into my life needing something from me, I was strong enough to engage on my own terms rather than simply grateful for any attention they were willing to give. That strength, earned through years of building a life according to my own values, became the foundation for a relationship that honors both our connection as family and our identities as separate individuals. The farmhouse where my grandfather taught me to see my own worth now stands as a symbol of the new dynamic we've created. My parents live there as my tenants, a daily reminder that respect and consideration flow both ways in healthy relationships. Every month when they write the rent check, they're acknowledging that I'm no longer the dependent daughter they once controlled, but an independent woman who chooses to maintain a relationship with them. The experience taught me that family relationships, like all relationships, must be earned and maintained through consistent respect and care. Blood relation creates connection, but it doesn't guarantee love or ensure healthy dynamics. Sometimes the greatest gift we can give each other is the willingness to start over, to rebuild on a foundation of mutual respect rather than entitlement and obligation. Looking back, I can see that my mother's harsh ultimatum about me being dead to the family was actually the beginning of my real life. It forced me to discover who I was without their approval and to build relationships based on genuine connection rather than duty. When they eventually needed my signature to resolve their own problems, I was no longer the desperate daughter seeking validation. but a confident woman who could offer relationship on terms that honored both our history and our individual worth. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up, just click and check them out.